Okay, this program will introduce us to the cells of the nervous system. And there's two general types of cells we're going to talk about. The primary one are neurons. So we'll describe the structure and function of neurons. And we'll talk about a little bit, just introduce how a neuron activates other cells. And then a much more abundant but less important type of cell are glial cells. So we're going to introduce glial cells. And I should introduce that guy there. That's from the movie Mars Attacks. So it's just a guy that's made up of a brain. It was a very bad movie, but I kind of like it. So, okay. So the two principal cell types, neurons, are the ones that do the main job of the nervous system. They are cells that can be excited to transmit signals. And very quickly they can send us a signal from one end of the cell to another, and they can activate other cells. And then non-neurons, or glial cells or support cells, these are cells that help neurons. They surround them. They're far more numerous, but they're much smaller. But they still account for like over half of the brain's weight, and then sometimes they're very, very important in determining the function of a neuron. And there's more types of these, so we'll talk about glial cells first. So glial cells are these supporting cells. They provide scaffolding for neurons. They segregate them. They insulate them. They are important in the development of the nervous system so that they can kind of generate where the neuron's supposed to go. They promote the health of the nervous system and growth. And there are different types of glial cells depending where you are. In the central nervous system, the primary ones are astrocytes, microglial cells, ependymal cells, and oligocytes. And in the peripheral nervous system, it's satellite cells and Schwann cells. And so they're important, and I'll show you some examples. And really, these cells are crucial for nerve function, and in many ways, the different types of nerve tissue are more, the differences in the glial cells are the primary difference. Okay, so let's look at some glial cells in the central nervous systems. By far the most abundant are the astrocytes. Astrocytes are highly branched, but they're very small. They cling to neurons, they kind of hold them in place. They also surround blood vessels, they form the blood-brain barrier. They guide neurons to the right place when they're developing. They process substances, like they might recycle a neurotransmitter or soak up extra potassium ions, and they're important in inflammation. They can sometimes act like immune cells in the nervous system. Another type of glial cell in the central nervous system are ependymal cells. They actually look like epithelial cells in the nervous system, and they form like membranes inside them. They line the spaces or ventricles inside the brain and the central canal of the spinal cord. They form structures that produce the cerebral spinal fluid, and they're ciliated, so they cause that fluid to move. So very important. Another type of glial cell inside the central nervous system are microglia. Very small cells that look a little bit like astrocytes, but they're more ovoid, which is just roundish. And again, they act kind of like immune cells. They're phagocytic, and they can, remove debris and perhaps some infectious agents. In the peripheral nervous system, there are two types of nerve cells that are really important. One are Schwann cells, and another are satellite cells, and they're just found in different places. Schwann cells wrap around neurons, and they produce a material called myelin, which is really important. It helps the nerve cell transmit messages faster, and so really crucial. And so we often talk about white matter, and that white matter are cells that have myelin in them. And so these are cells that are in the peripheral nervous system, and they, again, may be very, very abundant. Oligodendrocytes do the same job inside the central nervous system. They produce myelin, and so you can kind of see here the cell wraps itself around part of the axon part of the nerve cell, and it insulates it so that it can send messages faster. And so we'll talk a lot about myelin because myelin is really important. They cells wrap around parts of a neuron. This acts like an insulating layer. It's a fatty material. And it electrically insulates the neuron and increases the speed of nerve transmission. So there's a nice diagram here where you can see the cell both lengthwise and in cross section. And there's an actual picture of the cell wrapped around an axon. So really kind of a cool thing. So that should get us to start talking about neurons. Neurons are the business cells of the central nervous system. They can receive stimuli and transmit action potentials. We'll talk a lot about those later. Just for now, it's just action potentials. These are large cells. They're very, very long-lived. They have a big cell body or soma where they produce lots of protein. They have short branches, which are usually called dendrites, that can receive signals. And then they have often very long branches called axons that transmit signals to other cells. Axons might be wrapped by oligodendrocytes or Schwann cells and so may be myelinated, and that will make them work much, much faster. Neurons, I mentioned, they're kind of different from other cells. They have a nucleus, they have a nucleolus. They generally produce a lot of protein, so they have these big endoplasmic reticulums, which were called Nissl bodies or Nissl substance because it's actually visible under the microscope. And they're making proteins, which they use to do a lot of things. They'll also have other organelles present. They'll generally lack centrioles, and they won't go through mitosis. They don't divide well, and so it's hard to get them to heal. And so we talk about neurons. These extensions are quite long, and collections of nerve cell bodies are important. In the central nervous system, we call these nuclei, where lots of nerve cell bodies are clustered. In the peripheral nervous system, these are ganglia. There'll be swellings. So these are active cells. They use lots of energy, but they're not dividing. They're making new proteins, and they're sending and receiving messages. Neurons generally all do kind of the same thing, but they might be slightly different shaped. And so you have, in the central nervous system, you have lots of multipolar neurons where they have dendrites where they receive information from lots of other cells, but only have one axon. And that axon may branch at its distal end. And so multipolar neurons are typical of the central nervous system and motor neurons. Bipolar and unipolar neurons are more specialized. Bipolar neurons, I think you see those in the some sensory structures like in the olfactory nerve. And so you have one axon and one dendrite. Both the dendrite and the axon may branch at their end, but near the cell body there's only one of each. And in some cases, many sensory nerves will have unipolar neurons, where the neuron has a single branch that functions as kind of an axon and a dendrite. Okay, so this is just a little introduction, but all neurons can transmit electrical signals, and these are cell potentials. They do this by having specialized membrane proteins. And these membrane proteins are embedded in the membrane, and they allow ions to diffuse through, or they pump ions. And this means that neurons have charged membranes. They're more negative inside than outside. And even at rest, neurons maintain this charge. It's about minus 90 millivolts. And that's because they have lots and lots of sodium ions outside. So there's this big gradient of sodium ions outside. They also have some more potassium inside and some more negatively charged protons. And neurons have this charge. They're always like a charged cell or like a battery, and they can rapidly change their charge in what's called an action potential. And this is where the charge goes from minus 90 to 0 or even slightly positive, and it spreads usually from a dendrite all the way across an axon. And this is characterized by ion channels opening. And this is very brief. These channels open and then close, and then the neuron becomes repolarized. And so it takes a very short amount of time. And so they can very quickly send a message across their length, and they may be 3 feet long sometimes from dendrite to axon. When neurons send this axon potential down their axon, it eventually reaches a synaptic terminal, and this ends in a bulb, and that bulb has inside of it little vesicles that store a chemical called a neurotransmitter. And when that action potential reaches the synaptic bulb, these vesicles will fuse with the membrane and release the neurotransmitters. And those neurotransmitters will diffuse across this little gap to act on receptors on a cell that's going to be stimulated. And so this is how neurons activate other cells through what's called a chemical synapse. And then those other cells will be activated by that chemical. We'll talk more about this in the next program.